At 30, I was ready to resign, and this secret, one-sided love that no one knew about was finally coming to an end. I had spent 5 years working my way up from assistant to David Jones's chief secretary, and another 3 making myself indispensable to him. In the end, it took me 5 minutes to finish my resignation letter, and 1 second to send it. When I handed in the resignation, David Jones frowned slightly. He lifted his eyes and looked at me, his gaze quiet and unhurried. "Give me a reason." I dropped my eyes to avoid his, tugged at the corner of my mouth, and forced out the most sincere smile I could manage. "President Jones, I'm 30 now. It's about time for me to get married." I thought for a moment, then added, "My boyfriend proposed to me not long ago." Just so I could resign smoothly, I told a harmless little lie. David's fingers tapped the tabletop, one beat after another. That meant he was extremely irritated. Perhaps I should have been glad. At least my leaving wasn't something he could be completely indifferent to. After a long time, David handed the resignation letter back to me. "I can approve a marriage leave for you. As for resigning, I hope you'll think it through." For a split second, I wavered. In my head, a voice kept whispering, almost like a spell, "Say yes. Say yes. At least you'll still be able to see him, star." Another voice, however, warned me, Joyce Rivers, he's about to get engaged. Being secretly in love with another woman's husband is immoral, star. My hands hovered in midair for a long time. In the end, I still didn't take the letter back. This job is too demanding. After I get married, I'd like to focus more on my family. I'll make sure to hand over everything I'm responsible for. I'm sorry, President Jones. With things said to this point, David fell silent. At last he replied, lightly, "I understand. Congratulations on your marriage." By the time I walked out of his office, David had already bowed his head over his work again. After all, to him I was only a subordinate, at most, the most useful one. That day, I sat down at my desk and stared blankly at the potted plant on it for once. I rarely had time to space out like that. My daily workload was heavy. I was responsible not only for coordinating all his business arrangements, but also for acting as David's personal assistant in life. My phone was on standby 24 hours a day. Whenever David needed me, I had to rush over immediately. One person doing the work of several. Of course, David also gave me a salary generous enough. In just a few years, I had achieved financial independence. Tim called my name several times in a row before I came back to myself. "Sister Joyce, President Jones asked me to tell you should head over early to set things up for tonight's gathering." The party that evening was to welcome Lewis Smith, who had just come back from studying abroad. The guests were all the usual ones from David's inner circle. Young heirs of the great families, wealthy and powerful, with standards higher than the sky. By rights, outsiders weren't welcome in their circle, except that I was simply too useful. Someone who could take care of everyone's moods and preferences, arrange the entire event so everything ran like clockwork and nothing went wrong. That kind of person was rare. When I arrived at the venue, I immediately threw myself into work. From dishes to drinks to desserts, from each young master's allergies to what they liked or hated, I went over it all one by one with the staff. Remove all the lilies from the banquet hall. Young Master Jordan is allergic. Dim the lights a little. Young Master Johnson just had eye surgery. Don't forget the Huangshan Maofeng tea young Master Smith likes to drink. Make sure it's ready. By the time the sun had completely dropped behind the hills and the sky grew dark, people began to wander in. Alan Johnson was the first to arrive. When he saw me, he greeted me from across the room. "When is David getting here?" I checked my watch and answered dutifully, "He still has a meeting tonight. I'd estimate about an hour." He collapsed onto the couch, listless, dark circles under his eyes, looking utterly exhausted. I asked someone to turn the music down a little, then found a blanket and handed it to him. "The autumn nights are chilly. Don't catch a cold. It'll be a while before everyone gets here, try to rest a bit." He took the blanket with a laugh and teased, "You sure you don't want to dump David and jump ship to me? I'll give you double the salary." People like them were surrounded by sycophants tripping over themselves to flatter them, which made me seem especially different. Because I wanted nothing from them, it was easy for me to be open and straightforward. In return, I had somehow earned a measure of their respect. Playing along, I smiled and replied, "I'll remember that. If I ever find myself with nowhere to go, I hope young Master Johnson will take me in." As night deepened and the streetlights came on, the city lights flared brighter and everyone slowly arrived. David walked in wearing a black overcoat, bringing with him a thread of autumn's chill. I took the coat from his hands, thinking that this might be the last time I ever did so. When the wine had flowed enough and spirits were warm, I seized the right moment to mention my resignation. Over the years, I had been under their care often enough. I rose to my feet and raised my glass to everyone. "I'm going to resign. I used to know nothing and made a lot of mistakes. Thank you for putting up with me all these years. I hope, even if we go our separate ways, that there'll still be a chance to see you again someday. Perhaps it was the autumn in the air adding to the feeling of parting, but the table fell quiet for a moment. In the end, it was Alan who lifted his glass toward me from a distance, breaking the awkward silence. At first, I was sure you had ulterior motives toward David. It's only now that I finally believe you really don't. Everyone at the table understood what he meant. After all, David's previous secretaries had all been fired for confessing their feelings to him. Later, David simply started hiring only male secretaries, who also ended up confessing, until he earned himself the title of Lady Killer, regardless of gender. Someone clapped David on the shoulder and joked, "Didn't expect it, did you? There really is someone who can resist your charm." David lit a cigar with offhand nonchalance and cursed with a faint smile, "Get lost." After dinner, a few of them gathered a table for cards, whiling away the time at random. Partway through, Alan asked casually, "David, that girl from the Clark family your grandma picked for you, have you met her yet?" My heart skipped a beat, and the hand-pouring tea froze mid-air. After a moment, David answered carelessly, "No. As long as Grandma's happy, it doesn't matter. A wife is a wife." For people like them, marriage was always weighed against layers of interests and considerations. From a certain angle, they enjoyed resources ordinary people couldn't even imagine. Paying a price for that was only fair. It seemed David had already accepted those rules as well. I had met Maria Clark once. A Jiangnan girl, gentle, sweet-tempered, a truly good young woman. If it were possible, I had always hoped David would have a different kind of ending from the rest. The dinner dragged on till late into the night. Drivers had been waiting outside the whole time, ready to pick them up the moment things wrapped up. Only David's driver had run into a minor accident on the way, so he arrived late. So the scene I wanted least appeared, a two-person moment with just the two of us. We stood side by side under the street lamp, the light stretching our shadows out long. It was always at times like this that the unwillingness and dark thoughts in my heart grew loud and unruly. David, of course, knew nothing. He simply stood there quietly, the alcohol softening the sharpness he usually carried. After a while, the driver finally arrived. David turned his head and looked at me. With gentlemanly politeness, he asked, "Want a ride?" I shook my head and offered a grateful yet properly distant smile. "Thank you, President Jones, but my fiancé is already on his way." David said nothing more. He gave a slight nod of acknowledgement and bent to get into the car. At last, I was the only one left in the world. The masks I had layered over myself all day finally slipped off, one by one. I kicked off my high heels and sent them skittering away, then dropped down to sit on the edge of the flower bed, dazed for once. For a brief moment, I truly didn't know where I should go. After a short while, a fine drizzle started falling. The first autumn rain after the start of the season landed on my skin, cold and clammy. Barefoot, I walked along the road out of the neighborhood. This was a rich district. It took me a long walk before I finally reached a place where I could catch a cab. The road I usually took home was under construction that night, and the driver didn't know, so we had to double back and take a different route. David hadn't expected to see Joyce again, standing in the rain by the side of the road, one hand holding a single shoe, swinging it lazily. He was a little surprised. He hadn't thought the always composed and meticulous Secretary Rivers would have such an unrestrained side. After all, every time he saw her at the company, she was in a crisp suit, shirt buttoned all the way up to the collar. He had seen plenty of women with loosened collars, inadvertently leaning over in front of him, but Secretary Rivers was the exception. That was one reason he favored her, her professionalism, another was her sense of boundaries. Just as they were about to drive past her, the driver asked from the front, "Should we give Secretary Rivers a lift?" David's eyes didn't ripple. He replied simply, "No need." He had formed a poor impression of her fiancé. Secretary Rivers was a smart woman, but judging from her current choice, her eye for men was clearly not. Still, love is like drinking water, only the one drinking it knows whether it's warm or cold. It wasn't his place to interfere too much. I wasn't even sure if I'd seen David's car. It flashed by too quickly, maybe I was mistaken. People in rich districts rarely hailed cabs like I did. The driver had come from far away to pick me up. I stood there so long my legs were tingling with pins and needles before my car finally arrived. By the time I got home, it was already 2 or 3 in the morning. The whole house was silent. To the outside world, I told everyone I had a happy home, a fiancé who loved me, and many friends. People often looked at me with envy and said, "If life is like yours, it's complete enough." But in truth, I had nothing. No family. No lover. No friends. In my second year of middle school, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was already in the middle to late stages. Half a year after her mastectomy, it recurred. One ordinary morning, my father left for work and never came back. He took every cent from our home, leaving behind only my sick mother and underage me. When she heard the news, my mother was strangely calm. She went through chemo, stayed in the hospital, and whenever she was feeling a little better, she would still cook for me. One evening after school, I came home to find a full table of dishes my mother had prepared. She sat across from me, smiling at me with bright, gentle eyes. For some reason, a nameless fear rose in my chest. As I leaned closer to the dishes, there was a strange smell. I thought of the bottle of rat poison my mother had recently bought for the bathroom. That night, I learned just how strong my mother's grip could be, so strong I couldn't break free no matter how I struggled. The raw instinct to live drove me to wrench myself from her grasp in a moment of inattention. I stumbled blindly, not even knowing how I ended up on the rooftop. Crying, my mother followed and opened her arms to me, speaking in broken, frantic sentences. "Baby, the world is such a cruel place. I can't bear to leave you in it alone. Come with mommy. Next life, we'll still be mother and daughter." I cried too. I was so tired. I missed the smell of laundry detergent on my mother's clothes, the warmth of her arms. Maybe this is fine, I thought. Maybe there's nothing all that good about living. The wind on the rooftop was howling that night, but my mother's embrace was warm. Holding my hand, she took one step after another toward the edge. Just as we were about to fall, a pair of exhausted yet powerful arms caught me. He clamped down on me and refused to let go, no matter how I thrashed. In the chaos of wind and night, all I saw clearly was a pair of eyes, shining startlingly bright. In the end, I survived. My mother did not. That person was David. He not only saved my life, he gave me a reason to keep living. To repay a debt. I felt as if I had betrayed my mother. Back then, I was like a drowning person, desperate to grab at any floating piece of wood. David was that piece of driftwood. Soon the fire trucks, police cars, and ambulances all arrived. Amid the crowd and the commotion, I clutched his hand and looked up at him. "How can I ever repay you?" I still remember 16-year-old David lowering his head to look at me, answering very seriously, "Then remember to come find me." It was as if my life had been trapped on the night my mother died, and David was the only ray of hope shining ahead. That night, as always, I was swallowed by my dreams, and they were all made of the past. I saw my mother at the end of a corridor, demanding to know why I hadn't gone with her, and I saw again that silent look in my father's eyes before he walked out of our home. When I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, I found my voice was gone, my throat too raw to make a sound. I took my temperature, 38.8 degrees. If it had been the old me, I would probably have just taken a fever pill, brushed it off, and gone to work as if nothing had happened. This time, I did something rare for me. I called in sick. I needed some time to think about where my life was going. When David arrived at the office and discovered Secretary Rivers wasn't there, he asked around and learned she had taken sick leave. He frowned, and any remaining good impression he had of her so-called fiancé completely evaporated. The secretary assistant, Tim, temporarily took over Joyce's work and brought a cup of coffee into his office. David took an unhurried sip, his expression unchanged. There was one extra sugar cube in it. He said nothing, but after that one sip, he never touched it again. There was another mistake in the preparation of the morning meeting materials. Fortunately, he already knew the key points of the negotiation by heart, so nothing truly disastrous happened. The office was a degree colder than usual, the humidifier was off, and his throat felt a little dry. All day long, he couldn't quite say what was wrong, only that everything, in every detail, felt just slightly off. For the first time, David found himself thinking of Joyce. He almost never did, because she always seemed to have no presence at all. Joyce's competence was the kind that soaked through like a spring rain, nourishing everything quietly and unseen. You hardly noticed she was there, yet everything was exactly as it should be. He frowned again. It was the second time that day he had furrowed his brows. All because of that damned fiancé of Joyce's, who was taking away his chief secretary. I lay in bed for a whole day, thinking for a whole day, and still couldn't decide where I should go from here. I felt like a boat lost in a boundless ocean, unable to tell east from west, north from south. So the next morning, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I went obediently back to work. When I arrived at the office, Tim glanced at me nervously and whispered, "President Jones doesn't seem to be in a great mood." He only took one sip of yesterday morning's coffee. Yesterday's coffee was still sitting on his desk. I dipped a finger into it, tasted a little, and instructed softly, "There was one extra cube of sugar. It has to be 3 sugar cubes, no more, no less." I carefully demonstrated the whole process of making his coffee again, and Tim watched every step closely from the side. By the time the coffee was ready, David had arrived at the company. I didn't know if it was just my imagination, but when he looked at me, the corners of his lips seemed to curve a little higher than usual, and there was a faint hint of wounded resentment hidden in his eyes. The handover turned out to be much more troublesome than I had imagined. I was responsible for too many things, there was no way to transfer everything in an instant. On top of that, David was never an easy man to serve. Every little detail in his daily life had to be explained carefully and clearly. So I simply took a notebook and, from the smallest matters to the largest, wrote down whatever came to mind. Because of this delay, the work I had planned to hand over within a month had to be postponed. And so I ran headlong into the one task I wanted least to handle. I had to go to the airport to pick up Maria Clark and bring her to the old estate. I harbored feelings for David that I shouldn't have. Even if I had never actually done anything, seeing the rightful woman always made me feel a little guilty. Maria was wearing a pale, moon-colored chipao. Around her neck hung a piece of rich green jade that was clearly worth a fortune. Her hair was coiled up with a single hairpin. She was the kind of person you'd spot at a glance in any crowd, elegant, poised, unmistakably born to privilege. I lifted my smile and stepped forward to greet her. "Miss Clark, President Jones asked me to pick you up." On the way, Maria asked me a few questions about David. It was only natural to feel uneasy about marrying someone you had only met a few times. Sensing her anxiety, I softened my voice to reassure her. "President Jones is a very good man, Miss Clark. You don't have to worry. If anything comes up, you can always come to me." At that, she lifted her head and looked at me with grateful eyes. We chatted idly all the way to the old estate. I had originally planned to drop her off and take my leave. Master Jones called out to me. He had once been famous in the business world for his iron-fisted methods. Now, in his 70s, he was still vigorous, especially those sharp, penetrating eyes of his. "Secretary Rivers, where is David? Has David not arrived at the old house yet?" Keeping my expression steady, I answered carefully, "There's a lot going on at the company today. President Jones may be a little late." Master Jones gave a cold snort and, in his version of benevolence, ordered me to bring David back. I had seen with my own eyes how Master Jones punished David with the family's disciplinary cane, 6 lashes, each one cutting deep. The scars still mark David's back to this day. Once I left the hall, I immediately began dialing David's number. Thank heavens, he finally picked up on the 3rd try. I hurriedly asked where he was, but he didn't answer. After a long moment, he just called my name, "Joyce." His voice was thick and indistinct, as if he had been drinking, and in the background I could hear the roar of the sea wind. I thought I knew where he was. When I rushed over there, I found David leaning against the rocks by the shore, a few cans of cheap liquor from the supermarket scattered at his side, his hair tousled by the night wind. At the sound of my footsteps, he lifted his eyes to look at me. His gaze seemed veiled with a thin mist, yet it was still razor-sharp, as if he were drunk and yet somehow not drunk at all. "You're here? Give me a second, I'll be done soon." David patted the spot beside him lightly, motioning for me to come closer. "Let's talk." The Jones mansion sat not far from the sea cliffs, blazing with light at night, yet thanks to its pavilions and terraces, it still kept a trace of old-world charm. Suddenly, David asked, "Nice, isn't it?" My eyes were still lingering on the sharp line of his jaw, and I answered without thinking, "Beautiful." My face flamed red at once. Fortunately, he didn't seem to notice. He only went on, "But in truth, it's a tomb. So what if the halls are carved from white jade and the steeds are cast in gold? In the end, all that lies inside are countless bones." He said it with a smile, but every word was serious. Rumor had it that the rise of the Jones Group had not been clean, entangled with more than a little gray. In recent years, it had been undergoing a steady transformation. I had followed him for 7 years, watching as he gradually seized full control of the Jones Group. The storms of blood and intrigue, the open attacks and hidden traps, these were not things for outsiders to hear. So he got tired too, didn't he? With that thought came the question from my lips, "Are you happy?" The word happy seemed to roll on his tongue for a moment. Then he suddenly laughed, but still didn't answer my question. Instead, he looked at me and said, "Your fiancé is no good." I froze. He didn't elaborate, only inclined his head slightly and apologized, "Sorry. I crossed a line." After David drained the last mouthful of liquor from his can, he rose to his feet. When he lifted his head again, he was once more that impossibly aloof and dignified President Jones. On the way home, I kept turning his words over and over in my mind, trying to figure out what he meant. I thought for a long time and still couldn't find an answer, just as I had never figured out why, all those years ago, he had appeared alone on the rooftop of that dilapidated building. But none of it had anything to do with me anymore. I was leaving. From now on, with mountains high and rivers long between us, we were unlikely to ever meet again. It was raining on the day I resigned. In the south, the rain always fell fine and dense, a soft patter that seemed to have no end. I sat at my desk in silence, packing up my things. I had sat in that seat for nearly 10 years, growing from a clueless girl in her early 20s into someone who could stand on her own. I knew that every morning at 9, sunlight would slant across my little cactus. I also knew that if I quietly rose on tiptoe, I could glimpse David's silhouette through the gap in the blinds. For a long time, I had used these small, clumsy rituals to stagger forward through this world, but now, I was leaving. I had spent 8 years repaying the debt of a single life. The rest of the road should be walked with Maria at his side. Tim's eyes were brimming with tears as she looked at me. I wiped them away and smiled. Silly, it's not like we'll never see each other again. But in my heart, I knew we wouldn't. This city held too much of my pain. It was time for me to go. As I turned to leave, a little regret still tugged at me. I had deliberately dragged out the handover for so long, yet I had never managed to see David one last time. After I left the company, I went home and slept like the dead, as if trying to make up all at once for the sleep I'd lost over the years. I bought some alcohol and turned the television up as loud as it would go. A comedy was playing. I laughed, laughing like an idiot. When the laughter faded, I just sat on the floor in a daze, staring at the darkness all around me, utterly at a loss. When I was little, my biggest wish was to study hard. As long as my grades were good, my parents wouldn't fight. After my father left, my wish became to earn enough money to keep my mother alive. Then, after my mother died, my wish was to become David's most capable assistant. If he was happy, then I would be happy. But now, suddenly, I no longer knew where I was supposed to go. While I was staring blankly into space, the doorbell rang. I checked the peephole, and to my shock, it was David. In a panic, I opened the door, only then realizing I was still wearing my pink bunny pajamas. It was far too late to slam the door shut again. All I could do was brazen it out, invite him in, and try my best to pull my features into something like a professional smile. Compared to my fluster, David seemed perfectly calm. He explained, "I called you. Today's document is too urgent, and I couldn't find the backup draft for a moment. I happened to be driving nearby." The flush on my face lasted only an instant. Very quickly, I put my professional smile back on. "All right, President Jones, please have a seat. I'll need a moment to locate it." While I was searching for the file, David sat on the sofa. His manners kept him from looking around the room, so he simply kept his eyes fixed on me. It made me feel like I was sitting on pins and needles, and the more nervous I got, the less I could find anything at all. David chuckled softly and said in a soothing tone, "Take your time." Then he asked, "Doesn't Secretary Rivers's fiancée live here with you?" I lied without thinking, "He only comes back at night." It took me a full half hour to sort out all the documents he needed and print them out before finally handing them over to David. He took the file, then, for some reason, just stared at me, so intently that I felt a chill rise under my skin. I had just opened my mouth when he suddenly smiled. It was still that warm, spring-like smile of his that somehow held everyone at a distance. "I'm about to get married, and I really can't find anyone suitable to put in charge. I wonder if Secretary Rivers might do me a favor? I'll pay you your usual salary." I had no practice turning David down, my body answered before my mind could. I nodded, inexplicably, swallowed back the words that had risen to my lips, and gave the man before me a small, shallow smile. After that day, I returned to David's side to oversee his engagement ceremony. I thought that maybe this was for the best. Only by witnessing his marriage with my own eyes could I truly give up. Because I felt guilty toward Maria, I insisted on doing everything personally, hoping she would have a perfect engagement. But I had no idea what David had been so busy with lately. He rarely showed up. Whenever there was something to decide, he contacted only me, and I would relay his wishes. It was as if this weren't his engagement banquet at all, but someone else's. Maria looked more forlorn with each passing day. When she was trying on her dress one afternoon, she glanced at me with something close to pleading. "Secretary Rivers, could you help me ask if he's coming today?" By strict professional standards, I shouldn't have made that call. But I did. When the line connected, David's voice came through. "Hello?" The background was noisy, and there was a husky edge to his voice that only came after drinking. He was clearly at a banquet. I had intended to hang up, but Maria's sorrowful expression flashed through my mind, so I chose my words carefully and asked, "The dress arrived today. Will you be coming to the old house?" There was no sound from the other end for a long time. Just as I was about to apologize for overstepping, David spoke. "All right. Come pick me up." I didn't know why he wanted me to fetch him, but I did as he said. By the time I rushed over, the party had already broken up. David alone was sprawled on the sofa, drenched in drunkenness. I half knelt on the floor, gently patted him, and called, "President Jones, President Jones." He suddenly lifted his head and looked straight at me. His gaze was sharp as a blade, and I froze. But it lasted only a second. Almost at once, his eyes grew hazy again, shrouded in alcohol, as if that earlier flash had been my imagination. I helped him up and staggered with him to the car. The moment he got in, he fell asleep. Through the rearview mirror, I had a perfect view of his face. I rarely got the chance to look at him openly, so I couldn't help stealing a few more glances. My guilt toward Maria deepened yet again, and I forced myself to look away, silently reciting a calming mantra over and over. For some reason, a thin thread of unease tugged at my heart. I had always trusted my instincts, and my mind began to turn quickly. Something wasn't right. A black SUV had been following behind me from just after I left, and it had already been half an hour. President Jones, President Jones. I tried to shake David awake, but he remained motionless in the back seat. With no other choice, I stepped harder on the gas. The car behind also sped up, and soon we were both flying along the coastal highway. It was obvious the SUV had been modified. No matter how much I accelerated, it followed with ease, until at last I watched it veer straight toward us and ram into our car, then speed away. With a tremendous crash, our car rolled onto its side. At the last second I yanked the steering wheel, and that was the only reason we didn't plunge directly into the sea. A red fog filled my vision, my head was pounding, and I struggled to crawl out from the gap between the seats. David was pinned behind his seat. He finally opened his eyes and tried to free himself, but the twisted frame of the car had him trapped. I found a crowbar in the trunk and used every scrap of physics I knew to try to pry the door open, but the metal wouldn't budge an inch. The fuel tank had ruptured. Gasoline was spilling out and spreading across the ground, and the air around the back seat was beginning to fill with the acrid smell of smoke and burning. The more critical the situation, the clearer my mind became. Useless emotions like fear and panic had no room in me. There was only one thought left in my head: I had to get David out. The fire kept crawling forward. The car could explode at any moment. David lifted his eyes to me. "The salary I pay you isn't worth you risking your life to save mine. Secretary Rivers, go. The car is going to blow." I was already irritated, and on top of that he wouldn't stop talking. I cut him off viciously. "Shut up." For some reason, David suddenly laughed. I had no time to dissect whatever that laugh meant. The flames were still spreading. At some point, a gash had opened on my hand. Blood dripped onto the ground, one drop after another. Using the last of my strength, I finally managed to get David out of the wreck. Then I slung his arm over my shoulders and, step by heavy step, led him away. We had barely gotten clear when the car exploded, a ball of red fire that lit up the entire night sky. I was grateful I'd never let myself be brainwashed by the pale skinny young beauty standard. I was strong enough, with enough stamina, to drag both myself and David away from death. In the distance, I heard the wail of an ambulance. Only then did the exhaustion come crashing down over me like a tidal wave. My vision went completely black. David woke up before Joyce did. In the last instant before impact, Secretary Rivers had yanked the steering wheel toward her own side. He sat at Joyce's bedside, and it felt as if he were really seeing the woman in front of him for the first time. Many people had abandoned David. When he was a child, he and his father had once been kidnapped. There was only room for one person on the escape boat, and his father had thrown him aside without hesitation. No matter how he cried or screamed, he could only watch as that boat drifted farther and farther away. His mother had once promised him she would never leave, yet in the end she still ended her life with a length of rope. Many people had walked into his life, and many had discarded him just as easily. He was always the one left behind. The woman before him had more reason than anyone to abandon him, and yet she hadn't. He had always prided himself on seeing straight through people, but this time he had no idea what this woman wanted. What did she want? He wondered. It felt like I'd had a bizarre, kaleidoscopic dream. When I woke up, David was sitting there, watching me thoughtfully. My heart dropped like a stone. Had he already seen through my improper feelings for him? David looked at me quietly. Our eyes met, and my palms began to sweat as if I were waiting for a verdict to be pronounced. "Why did you save me?" My mind whirred into motion, and the next second I smiled and replied, "President Jones, I'm a gambler. The chance to be owed a life by the CEO of Jones Group isn't something just anyone gets." David frowned slightly, his gaze steady and deep as he studied me, as though assessing how much truth there was in my words. "What do you want?" In his world, the rule was that the ones who claimed to want nothing were usually the greediest of all, and that a clean exchange of interests was what made people feel safest. I thought very carefully about what I could ask for that would be worth risking my life and reassured him at the same time. "I want 1% of Jones Group's shares, in exchange for a lifetime of food and clothing." The tight line of David's brows eased. I knew I had played this move right. He smiled. "Shares are unreliable things. How about a storefront property in a prime commercial district instead? What do you think, Secretary Rivers?" I smiled too. "A shopfront worth tens of millions? Then thank you, President Jones." We each got what we needed, and David no longer had to feel any guilt toward me. So he rose and said lightly, "Then rest well, Secretary Rivers. You don't need to worry about the engagement anymore. I stayed in the hospital for a full week. The day I was discharged happened to be David's engagement day. My phone was flooded with news about the union of the Jones and Clark families, the venue dressed in roses so lavishly it looked like a dream. It was good. From now on, the bridge would be a bridge and the road a road, our paths would diverge. I had repaid my debt and received what I was owed. So why did I still feel a little sad? I wandered the streets alone with nothing to do and, by some twist of fate, ended up at a bar. Over the years, I had usually been the one to clean up after everyone else, so I rarely drank and never much liked it. They say a good drunk can wash away 1,000 sorrows, but the liquor was so bitter it brought tears to my eyes. My tears fell into the glass, turning it into something bitter and salty all at once. Right before my consciousness slipped away, I placed an errand order and instructed the runner to get me home safely. At the engagement banquet, David received a phone call. It wasn't one of the calls he had arranged in advance for an emergency, but a call from Secretary Rivers. It didn't matter, though. All he needed was an excuse to leave the engagement, the actual reason was unimportant. When he drove to the bar, a young man in a blue vest hurried over to him. She asked me to take her home, but she never told me where she lives. I really had no choice but to call her pinned contact. He glanced nervously at David. You're not her boss, are you? She isn't going to give me a bad review when she sobers up, is she? David took the limp form of Secretary Rivers from his arms and offered the flustered runner a few words of reassurance. Don't worry. She won't. Leave the rest to me. He supported Joyce as they walked outside. The woman in his arms was anything but well behaved. One moment she was poking his face, the next tugging at his hair. She really was drunk. They say people speak the truth when they're drunk, and David felt an urge to test that theory. Why did you come to work by my side? The woman frowned as if thinking hard, then giggled foolishly. To repay a debt. David's brows drew together again. What debt? A life-saving debt. David asked, and how are you planning to repay that debt? By giving him everything in this world that's best. Why give him everything that's best in the world? Because I love him. Back in university, David had taken an elective on interrogation techniques. The key was to follow the other party's logic step by step, then guide them gently into answering your own questions. He had thought he might be able to dig out some useful information this way. He hadn't expected to end up with this answer. She loved him. Secretary Rivers loved him. David looked at Joyce again and again. She was grinning like a fool, drunk beyond pretending. Many people had told him they loved him. He had seen many kinds of love, fierce as a blaze, gentle as a trickle. But this was the first time he had seen this kind of love, a love buried in the heart for years, known to no one. Some things that had never made sense suddenly did, like why there wasn't a single trace of a man in Secretary Rivers's home. David wondered if he could believe her. That it was only because of love that she had thrown life and death aside. The next day, I woke from my drunken sleep with my head splitting, vaguely remembering that I seemed to have had a dream. The only thing clear in my mind was David's dark, heavy eyes. Why had I dreamed of him again? Dreaming about another woman's husband was immoral, I told myself. For a long time after that, I forced myself not to pay attention to any news about Jones Group. I roamed from one end of the country to the other, taking trains and getting off at random stations, wandering aimlessly through different cities. I personally visited some people, evaluated their situations, and then made donations according to different levels of need. Sometimes I couldn't help thinking that maybe my mother had actually wanted to live. If, back then, someone had reached out a hand to pull me back, would everything have turned out differently? There were too many people in this world burdened with bitter lives. I could only help the ones within my sight. The next time I saw anything about David, it was the news that Jones Group had gone bankrupt. On the front page, a photo of David and Maria had been split cleanly down the middle. Across it, in blood-red characters, the headline screamed, "Alliance in ruins, where does Jones Group go from here?" Anxious, I called Maria. There was something like guilt in her tone, but in the end she only sighed. "Secretary Rivers, you should know this. I was never marrying a man. I was marrying a family. There's nothing I can do." Once the first wave of panic passed, my mind cooled, and the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Suddenly, I realized that perhaps this whole thing was orchestrated by David himself. In recent years, Jones Group had looked like a bouquet of flowers in full bloom, involved in every industry under the sun, but it was a giant with a tail too heavy to lift. Beneath that thriving surface, crisis was everywhere. I had tried to warn David, but he always brushed my concerns aside with a few light, non-committal words. I had thought he had other plans, but it turned out he had been holding this intention from the very beginning. I suddenly thought of how he'd looked that night he was drunk, and understood that, to him, the Jones family was nothing but a cage. All at once, I felt that there should be someone at his side right now, just as, on the night my mother tried to jump with me, David had clamped down on my hand and refused to let go. It didn't matter who that person was, as long as they held his hand. With that thought, I ran to the company without a second's hesitation. The building that had once blazed with light was now more than half dark. The last of the company's funds had all gone into staff compensation. I walked through rows and rows of cubicles and pushed open the office door. David was wrapped in shadow, the wind in the Capitol rattling the blinds against the window. He lifted his eyes to look at me, his gaze murky, impossible to read. I stepped forward and took his hand. On my way there, I had imagined 1,000 things I might say, and now I could not remember a single one. In that moment, all I knew was that I had to hold his hand, the way he had held mine so many years ago. His thoughts drifted back to his mother, the poor girl who had married into a wealthy clan only to become the madwoman everyone hid away. People had tried to mold a wild, mountain child into the perfect matriarch of a great house. She had to be false and polite, calm and restrained, learned in sacrifice and compromise. Every single person along the way had thrown another log onto the fire that burned her sanity. Later, they said she lacked the blessing, that she wasn't fit to shoulder such a heavy role. But what if it was the rules themselves that were wrong? Behind closed doors, Jones Group still ran some illegal schemes. It was because his mother saw certain things and couldn't bear them, because she refused to become someone who fed on others, that, in the end, the world devoured her instead. David had originally planned to face everything alone, to let all the sins and filth fall back into dust where they belonged. But then Joyce showed up. Was it because of love? He had seen her the moment she arrived. While everyone else was busy packing up and fleeing, she moved against the flow, picking her way through the wreckage on the floor to walk toward him. Like a knight racing to protect her princess, he thought, and couldn't help a small laugh. How could there be such a first-class fool in this world? She said nothing at all, just stepped forward and took his hand, warmth surging steadily from her palm into his. Only then did David realize just how cold his own hands were. So he clasped her hand in return. The wind could swirl, the rain could sway, but her warmth was the one solid, undeniable thing. I stayed with David as he completed the final liquidation of Jones Group. When he faced the media, some outraged person hurled eggs at him. Jones Group owed too many blood debts. The fury of the masses needed somewhere to go. This was a price that had to be paid. On the day Jones Group officially declared bankruptcy, Master Jones suffered a cerebral infarction and was rushed to the hospital. David asked me to drink with him. It was only when I arrived at the address that I realized it was his home in the city center. I stopped in the doorway, suddenly awkward. This doesn't seem very appropriate, does it? I wanted to say that our relationship didn't feel like one where we could just drink together, and that stepping in like this made me feel as if I were overstepping my bounds. David lowered his eyes. There was a bleakness about him, and I thought I heard a slight catch in his voice. Had he been crying? Whatever the case, he was still his grandfather. My heart clenched painfully at the thought. I took the bottle from him, and his eyes lit up a little. Forget it, I thought. If I'm going to accompany him, I might as well go all in. Endurance has always been what I do best. I had never seen David like this before, his shirt and tie loosened, his suit rumpled, dejected and fragile, as if he were about to dissolve into the night. He had always seemed like someone who lived in the sky, forever surrounded by people wherever he went, every gesture carrying an effortless nobility. But now, it was as if that man from the heavens had suddenly fallen down to earth. He was drunk and dazed, calling my name over and over, insisting I answer each time. His voice, hoarse from the alcohol, thudded against my eardrums, one call after another, like a steady knocking on my heart. All at once, he leaned in close. There were only a few inches between us. I could see the light catching on his lashes, casting a scatter of shadows. Secretary Rivers, will you always be here? I didn't answer. After all, no one could promise to stay by anyone's side forever, and what right did I have, exactly, to always be by his? He wouldn't let it go, though. He kept asking, stubbornly, as if he wouldn't stop until he got an answer. In the end, I could only sigh inwardly and say, yes. I'll always be here. Satisfied at last, David quieted down for a while, frowning a little as he looked at me, lost in thoughts I couldn't read. Then, for no clear reason, he suddenly said he was hot and yanked off 2 buttons from his shirt, revealing a hint of something almost tempting. I had never imagined such a word could one day be used in the same breath as David. I froze for a moment, then forced myself to wrench my gaze away. Yet somehow, even as he kept saying he was hot, he kept drifting closer to me. I could feel my face burning. I thought to myself, this winter is really too warm. Summoning the last of my self-control, I pulled some distance between us. He looked up at me for no apparent reason, then went back to drinking, pushing himself until he was completely, utterly drunk. In the last second before he passed out, he stared at me for a long time, his eyes holding something that felt strangely like encouragement. Why encouragement? After settling David onto the bed, I went home and lay awake the whole night, still unable to figure out why his gaze had felt that way. The next day, David called to thank me especially for taking such good care of him. I laughed, a little embarrassed, and said politely, "It's what I should do, President Jones." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then David ground out my name through clenched teeth. "Joyce, you really?" Before I could ask what he meant, the call ended, leaving me completely baffled. Jones Group was gone now, and it seemed that David and I no longer had any reason to keep seeing each other. It had already been several days since I last saw him. The next time I did, he was swaying on his feet, knocking at my door in a drunken haze. The moment I opened it, he collapsed into my arms. I used every ounce of strength I had to drag him onto the sofa. Just as I straightened up to leave, he grabbed me. I lost my balance and fell straight into his embrace. Our faces were suddenly very close. He looked at me with utmost seriousness and called my name softly, "Joyce." In that moment, there was only me in his eyes, and my heart started pounding wildly, completely out of control. Closer, closer, he leaned toward me slowly, until everything after that was a blur, a tangled mess that slipped off its tracks. All the self-restraint I'd prided myself on burned to ash in an instant. When I woke up the next morning, I panicked and ran. Halfway down the street, I suddenly remembered this was my own home. I loitered outside until the sky grew dark, then carefully pushed the door open. The lights flicked on. David was still there, lifting his eyes to look at me with a half-smile. "What's wrong? Trying to skip out on taking responsibility?" I froze in place, neither able to advance nor retreat. "We should talk." I'd originally meant to persuade him not to take last night to heart, that men and women, under the influence of alcohol, could be forgiven for one night of confusion. He looked at me with helpless resignation and stopped me. "Nothing good ever comes out of that mouth of yours, so you listen to me first." David's expression was extremely serious. He hadn't even looked this solemn on the day Jones Group went bankrupt, and his gravity made me tense up at once. "Joyce, you think too highly of me. In truth, I'm very ordinary. Every petty greed, anger, and jealousy a normal person has, I have them all." I shook my head, wanting to protest, but he continued before I could speak. "I know perfectly well your head isn't clear right now, and it's unfair to make you decide anything at this moment. But if I give you time, I'm afraid that once you really see what kind of person I am, you won't like me as much anymore. Whatever your feelings for me are, gratitude, respect, admiration, you were the one who provoked me first, and you don't get to walk away without finishing what you started." David somehow produced a ring from who knows where, his gaze burning as he looked at me. "So, Joyce, will you marry me?" My mind went completely blank. I don't even know how I ended up nodding, but somehow the ring was already sliding onto my finger. "Do you have your ID card with you?" I nodded on instinct. David smiled at me. "Then let's go." "Go where?" "To get our marriage certificate." We became the last couple of the day at the Civil Affairs Bureau. When we stepped back outside, it was dusk. The clouds were blazing, the sunset painting half the sky red. And with that, all my wild longings and stubborn unwillingness finally settled into dust.